Hello, my name is Andy Latham, and I want to welcome you to our course on the Application Designer Gauges Control. As with the other courses, there are some prerequisites, but fundamentally by now you should be confident in maneuvering around App Designer. You will have written a few of your own applications, and you should have a good working knowledge of VBScript. In this course, I'm going to cover an overview of the radial gauge and the arc gauge, and just talk to you about what they're capable of doing. Then we'll have a look at the gauges in action in App Designer, and we'll go through a worked example. And then, as you will soon find, because the gauges are actually .NET user controls, we'll have a little section on seeing how they work in customized panes in standard programs. There are two App Designer gauges, a radial gauge and an arc gauge. They are designed as graphical ways to show a single piece of data within a set of parameters. So, for instance, you might be interested in looking at how much percentage of credit limit had been used by a customer, or what the run rate of a particular machine was, and whether it was running within a set of parameters. The gauges are actually .NET user controls, and they reside in base managed assemblies along with all the other .NET user controls that Syspro uses. But the App Designer provides an easy user interface to add the gauge control and configure the gauges for initial use. It also provides a call out function to be used in the VB script to be able to set the gauge's properties. Each gauge has its own manual located in base managed assemblies that you can link to from within App Design, and we'll see that shortly. And as I've already alluded to, because these are standard .NET user controls, you can use them in customized panes. So let's have a look at how they work. Each gauge takes an XML string that is passed to an update method of the user control. And this XML string defines a series of properties such as the title of the gauge, the scale. It might be going from 0 to 100 for a percentage. It might be going from minus 100 to plus 100 for something. It provides the units of the scale, the range of the scale, and you'll also see things like you can set the edge of the scales to change color dependent on certain parameters, and clearly, obviously, the single data values that the gauge is designed to display. The gauge only needs to be sent as much XML as is needed to make the necessary change. So we'll see shortly that in App Designer, you'll probably design the gauge look and feel, and then all you've got to do is send the data to it, or you don't have to keep on changing the look and feel. And as I say, the gauge is typically set up once on an initialization event, and then the value sent to it as you move through your program. But it doesn't stop you changing the look and feel during the run. So, for instance, one customer, you might have it with one set of scales, and another customer, another set of scales. So let's have a quick look at both these gauges. Here is the radial gauge. As I've said, it's located in base managed assemblies, and it's called Syspro MA _ gauge radial. And the documentation is the same name, but instead of a DLL, it's an RTF file. And if we have a look at these samples, you begin to get an idea of what we're trying to show you here. So as an example here, we've got units of measure, we've got a title, we've got a scale going from 0 to 100. And we're basically saying if the needle is pointing between 0 and 50, then it's pointing into a red section, which might indicate to an operator that there's something wrong. If it's pointing to the orange, then maybe it's okay and the green's fine. In this example, we've changed the color ranges. So this machine run rate, we're quite happy for it to be running between 0 and 60. But if it's running quicker than that, then maybe there's a problem. Here and the sales conversion, you see that we've actually told it we'd rather like the scale to be on the inside. And again, if the sale conversion is between 0 and 50, then there's clearly something wrong. 50 to 75, then it's okay. And if it's above 75, then conversion is pretty good. In this example, we've got the 0 starting at the top of the gauge. It's going negative 100 one way, positive 100 another way. And we're looking at stock level deviation. So we're quite happy for it to deviate maybe plus or minus 20%. But if it's any more than that either way, then clearly it's indicating red, there's something wrong. And if we have a quick look at the type of XML that's actually being sent to it, then it's just very, very simple. You've basically got a gauge radial root, and then you basically sort of saying, well, here's the units, the RPM, there's your value, 45, and then a series of elements which describe the scale, the colors, and so on like that. If we have a quick look at the art gauge, it's doing something very similar, but in a different way. The art gauge actually starts looking fairly bland and sort of a grayed out scale. But as you give it a value, the scale comes alive and you're basically telling it at what angle does the color change. So in this case, we're doing 72 kilometers an hour, and therefore it's indicating red. We can change things like the thickness and the dash gap between the gaps between these elements and the thickness, and you go from this dotted line to solid lines and so on. And there's all sorts of nuances of being able to play with the look and feel. Again, it's based in managed assemblies. That's its name, the DLL, and the documentation is the same name as the user control, but it's got RTF on the end. So within the app designer, when we actually add a gauge control to our app, what happens is that it'll ask you what type of gauge do you actually want to implement. And once you've selected it, it will display for you the properties, or in effect, the XML that configuration would require for you to configure and set the UI for the gauge as it starts. Now, what actually happens, App Designer will create this XML and send it to the gauge at startup, so you don't have to worry about that in the VB script. And then within your VB script, all you've got to do is actually send it to value, and the gauge will work. I reiterate that in this instance, I'm just sending the value. But if I wanted to change the scale, the colors, or anything like that, I can just send as much or little of the XML as required to make the change that I want. You certainly do not have to keep on, certainly in App Designer, sending the whole setup to the gauge each time. Okay, so now I've quickly whizzed through the overview, and you've got a basic idea of what they actually look like. Let's go and have an experiment in App Designer and see how this actually works.